Welcome, everyone. I am Rodrigo Silva. I'm the Communications Manager at Cogitatio. Today, we explore how citizens engage with European politics on social media, a discussion based on a thematic issue that was published in our open access journal, Politics and Governance. I will soon share the link with you. Let me introduce today's speakers. We have Pieter de Wilde from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Norway. He is one of the co-editors of the issue. We have Helena Seibicke from the University of Oslo in Norway, and Melanie Magin from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology as well in Norway. Helena and Melanie are both contributing authors of the issue. We also have the pleasure of welcoming Tom Moylan, political communication specialist working in the European Commission. To all of you, thank you very much for being here with us. Before we start, let me share some information with our attendees. So this is the order of presentations for today. Okay, Pieter, as editor of the issue, will go first. You will be followed by Helena, then Melanie, and then Tom will provide his final remarks. After that, we will jump to the Q&A session with our attendees. And so if you are out there with us, you are free to write your questions using the Q&A format on the bottom of your screen. You can write your questions throughout the whole session and upvote those questions to be read after Tom's presentation. I will now pass the floor to Pieter and wish you all a very pleasant webinar. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, morning, wherever you are. Very nice to see so many of you here. And I'm also very glad that Helena and Melanie are here to shed some more light on their own contribution, and also special thanks in advance to Tom for joining us for some comments that I really look forward to. I would just give a little bit of a background and some pointers of the general special issue, so you know where we came from, and at least what I find to be the most key take-home messages of the collective issue. And I won't say so much about the two specific contributions that will be presented by Helena and Melanie. So this special issue stems from a project that we're running here at NTNU in Trondheim, Norway, called Trondheim Analytica, which is, of course, a play to Cambridge Analytica, the company and the scandal that played in 2016, allegedly manipulating the Brexit referendum in the UK and the US presidential election in favor of Leave and Trump, respectively, through micro-targeting individuals. And we wanted to know, is that possible? Can we find out what your political preferences are through social media? What you post on social media, how revealing is that? And well, the short answer to that is no, it's illegal to find out. That's where GDPR came in, restrictions that the EU put in terms of privacy protection, followed by a closure that platforms like Twitter and particularly Facebook enacted, so that scientists like us don't have access to this data anymore and can't create the tools that would facilitate such a manipulation of democracy. And that led us to a redirection of the project towards an attempt to kind of shed light on what is and is not possible in this challenging, important, yet a shifting field of social media and politics, particularly in the European context with its major transnational dimension of politics, of course, within the framework of the European Union, but also elsewhere, where issues transverse across borders, where politicians learn from what others are doing in neighboring countries to echo or kind of copy strategies, and how that plays out on in a space that is at least potentially transnational. Now, so we asked the contributors to this special issue, what is it that you can find out about the way that citizens in Europe engage with European politics through social media? And can you, as honestly as possible, tell us what challenges you encountered trying to find out and discuss how either you navigated around them or overcome them, so that we can, as scientists, show a little bit of a glimpse into the kitchen of how science is made and not just present the end results without showing how they were made, with the aim to create transparency also in the research practice about what is and is not possible currently in terms of doing research on this topic. Now, you may have all witnessed the kind of euphoric debates early on that social media was going to be this platform that connected people and facilitated two-way communication on cross borders to boot, instantaneously creating a kind of digital public sphere. And then you've also witnessed the backlash, arguing, no, this is actually a place of echo chambers and increasingly polarized and populist communication. So we wanted to find out and asked our contributors, how much of that do you find? And well, I guess the short answer here is that European politics and European society is highly plural, highly diverse. Social media are a platform, but they're still human driven, which means that the diversity and the plurality of European citizens also comes across in social media. There are a lot of findings in different directions. So to those who see social media as a kind of negative echo chamber, polarizing sphere, we have found some limitations in that direction. For example, in the contribution by Stefan Walacek et al. Shows that even international issues like International Women's Day still are discussed very differently in the different European countries, despite the fact that they engage with the similar hashtags. So the national bias that we have in the offline public sphere is replicated in social media here. We also have a contribution, for example, by Tobias Heinreich and colleagues, who show that negative posts tend to create more engagement in terms of likes and retweets than positive ones. And Anna Jaroselska and Christina Monzer add to this that particularly appeals to anger fuel citizen engagement in Europe. And then to boot more to the negative perspective, we see that citizens grow tired over a while of elite crisis management, especially when it's very technocratic. So Daniel Thiele notices that discussions on COVID-19 over time became increasingly populist, increasingly frustrated as citizens voiced their frustration with measures against corona infections over time. But that's not the whole picture. We also have some positive news to share, which I'd like to come up with after the negative ones. One that, for example, there's a lot of information to gather on social media. Political institutions like those of the European Union have become a lot more professional in communicating what they're doing and how they're doing and why they're there via social media. This is in a contribution by Sina Özdemir and Christina Rau. Christian Rau in the special issue. And positive emotions, not just appeals to anger, but enthusiasm and pride can also generate a lot of engagement. This is surprisingly also something that populists do, as Anna Jaroselska and Christina Monzer show. And finally, the events like International Women's Day do generate a positive engagement across borders, even if it has different national tastes here and there. So there's like in the European reality offline, there's a lot of plurality and double findings in the European online public sphere. So where does this leave us now? What do I see as key avenues for future research? I'd like to know more beyond, or to think a bit about, what does engagement really mean? I think a challenge is that these platforms like Twitter and Facebook, they provide a quantified indicator of engagement through the number of likes and number of retweets. But can we go beyond these numbers? What does that really mean if somebody likes a post or not? How much engagement does that signify? I think here science is a bit like politics, is the art of the possible. We research what we can research, and that isn't always what we want to research or what we would research in an ideal world. I'd like to really see, where can we go beyond unpacking this concept of engagement beyond the likes and retweets and comments. And then finally, I think the key challenge that we face all here is one of access. How do we get the material to do the studies that we need? If you want to go beyond the numbers of engagement, you're going to have to get access to citizens, and that's exactly what the privacy legislation like the GDPR protects us from doing. So how do we get that material? And I'd like to end with a pointer to the final contribution in the special issue written by Kate Dommett and Rebecca Trumbull, who document their own activist life. They're scientists, but they're also became activists trying to create more access for scientists to social media platforms to do this kind of research. So lots of diverse findings, lots of challenges to engage with, and plenty to continue on. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for this first contextualization of the issue and the topic. I will now pass the word to Helena Seibicke.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to share a small PowerPoint presentation. And yes. So, that was quicker than I thought. So my contribution today is on behalf of myself and my co-author, Asimina Michailidou. We were both working at ARENA Center for European Studies. And our contribution to the special issue is basically looking at this aspect of citizen participation based on data we derived in a larger research project. So just to give you a little bit of background about the research project, and the project was called Benchmark, and this is a research project that was funded by the Norwegian Research Council, and it aimed to investigate whether and how Brexit affected the relationship between EU members and non-EU member democracies. So to this end, we analyzed public debates, and we analyzed who spoke for and for whom, and in whose name statements were made supporting different types of non-membership scenarios, such as, for example, the Norwegian model, or the WTA model, or the Canada model that were floated in the political sphere and in public debates about how a post-Brexit reality could look like for the UK. So for the purposes of this paper, we zoomed in on the issue of citizen participation in social and digital news media. Complementary to some of the papers in the special issue, we looked more directly, which looked more directly at citizen participation in social media. We also included more indirect representation of citizens' views by politicians who speak on behalf of their constituents, and we also included data sources such as newspapers and parliamentary debates. We had 3 country cases, the UK, Norway, and Switzerland. And Norway and Switzerland were chosen because they were floated as some of the possible post-Brexit models the UK could mold itself after, or could emulate. And that data was derived from newspaper sources, like I said, parliamentary debates and social media platform, Twitter. And to summarize our research findings, we found very little citizen participation. We found that citizens were hardly ever mentioned, invoked, or directly cited in all three data sources. So to elaborate a little bit more or take that into a larger context, we also reflected, like Pieter mentioned in his introductory remarks, on the challenges of conducting this type of research. So I want to give you a little bit of very brief summary of those challenges. So the first challenge is to locate citizens' voices in media discourse. Now, what does that mean? In the newspaper articles and parliamentary debates, it is usually established actors such as politicians or experts who speak for people. And we found that citizens were hardly ever directly cited or invoked, as I mentioned before. So we also included social media as a data source where citizens could potentially directly have their say. However, social media, even though it's been hailed as a great equalizer when it comes to public debate, it has been shown that it's an elite forum where it's usually elite actors with prominent public profiles that can influence public opinion. And that's also something we see in our data. So we want to sound a note of caution when trying to analyze citizen engagement or public debate in general, and then only focusing on social media, because it's somewhat selective in terms of which citizens engage or how much of a platform that really is for public debate. The second challenge, as Pieter also mentioned, is that of data access. So while arguably at one point it was too easy to access user data, data is now, media data especially, increasingly hidden behind paywalls. So this marketization of the public sphere and the digital commons and the associated costs of data access creates a challenge for researchers to conduct empirical studies about public debates. And of course, there is also the ethical dimension with GDPR associated with that. So there has been a growing debate in academic circles about the effect of GDPR rules on empirical research. So we are not challenging GDPR rules per se. Of course, there is a need for those. However, there are implications when those are enforced too stringently, and it means that it is almost impossible to access certain types of data. So especially for media research, GDPR rules have important implications. So for example, if we would have liked to quote some statements politicians have made, or citizens for that matter, in already published material, we would have had to contact these people and ask for consent. Now that is possible on a smaller scale, but if we want to have large amounts of data, that then becomes prohibitively impossible. So public sphere research is affected by GDPR rules, and it affects the type of data we can collect. And that, of course, then has implications not just for the scientific quality of the research, but also about the societal impact and the relevance of the research we can conduct. So I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helena, for your presentation. We will now be hearing from Melanie Magin. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I will just share my presentation. Yeah, okay. So I will present our paper called The Polyphonic Sounds of Europe, User Engagement with Parties' European-Focused Facebook Posts. And I published this paper together with a number of co-authors who come from a number of European countries. So this is a really European project. The starting point of this study was the so-called democratic deficit of the EU, which means that the EU has challenges or faces challenges when being in direct contact with the citizens and communicating directly with the citizens. This democratic deficit has also to do with that citizens consider European politics as less important than national politics. So when we talk about European parliamentary elections, what our study is about, then these are typically entitled second order elections, which means that both politicians and the news media and citizens consider these elections less important than national elections, which leads to less attention by political actors and by the media, and also less participation in the elections by the citizens. In recent past, we have seen a politicization of European politics, which might increase the visibility of the EU at the side of the citizens. But the problems with this is that this politicization focuses on conflict. So it focuses on topics which are discussed very controversially. So for example, migration and climate crisis. And that might lead to an increasing visibility of European politics, but this might potentially be destructive because it's a negative kind of attention that European politics gets. So it has been discussed how far social media can help with reducing the democratic deficit of the EU, because they enable European actors to take direct contact with the citizens. But here I come back to this visibility aspect of European politics. And here we must be clear about one characteristic of social media, and this is their popularity bias. This popularity bias means that content on social media which gets the highest rates of user engagement becomes visible to even more people. So content that is already very visible becomes even more visible. In other words, user engagement influences how visible posts get. And if a certain kind of content, for example, negative content on European politics or content on certain topics related to European politics gets particularly much user engagement, then this influences what image of the EU is presented on social media. And this was our starting point to ask how do Facebook users engage with content on European politics? How did we investigate that? We conducted a manual standardized content analysis of almost 9,700 Facebook posts from 12 countries, which were posted by parties during the European election campaign in 2019. Here you can see the 12 countries that we investigated. So we had a broad sample of European countries of different types. And what we focused on in our analysis was the content of the posts. And here we focused particularly on the political level that was addressed in the posts, the topics that were addressed, and if the posts contained negative elements. And then we also focused on the originators of the posts. So we compared populist and non-populist parties. The thought behind that is that populist parties often have a negative image of the EU and tend to post negative things about the EU. And then we investigated how content and originators affected the amount of user engagement. As everyone, as Pieter mentioned, we measured that by means of reactions, comments, and shares. So we investigated if this specific content and the originators led to more or less user engagement. Here you see some of our most important findings. So first of all, when we compare the 12 countries, we find that there is not any engagement gap between parties that are supportive towards the European Union and countries that are more Eurosceptic. What we find is that the level, the focus on national level posts is more strongly in countries which held national elections in the same year as the European elections. But this was the only systematic difference between countries that we could find. Then when we compared populist and non-populist parties, we found that populist parties do not create more user engagement than non-populist parties when they focus on EU content. Focusing on the EU does not help populist parties to get more user engagement. And then when it comes to the content-related characteristics that we investigated, we found that people do not selectively engage with EU-focused content based on its topics, particularly migration and environment, or a negative tone. In other words, the engagement gap between national level posts and European level posts does not become smaller when parties focus on migration and environment, or if they use a negative tone in their posts. So what follows from this is that European politics can spread on social media platforms in a less divisive and negative way than we expected, which is positive news, I would say. So what can we learn from these results? First of all, political actors should be aware of that it's important to make the EU relevant and salient on social media and to reclaim the narrative. And for that, they should use non-negative content. It does not help using negative content to make the EU more visible. But what is also important is that this probably works best if they use topics, policy topics, for which the EU is considered competent and more effective than national politics, because then people can relate that better to the competence and get a better positive image of the EU. On the part of the users, it's important that the users become aware that their engagement has an influence on which kind of content on European politics is visible on social media. So the more they engage with certain kind of content, the more visible becomes this content on social media. So if users want to support the European Union and want to support the positive visibility of the EU, they should like and share and comment on positive content about European politics. And finally, for public policies, our results mean that social media can contribute to reducing the EU's democratic deficit, but they are not the only solution for this problem. So this can only be one measure in a mix of several measures. And of course, we consider it important that research of this kind is funded and more funded than in the future. And of course, as Pieter also mentioned, we need data access for that to get deeper insights into how user engagement is affected by the content that political actors post on social media. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Melanie, for the presentation. And now for final remarks, we will be hearing from Tom Moylan.
Yeah, hey, hello, hi. Thank you for the invitation. Sorry, I was just finishing taking some notes based on that. I've obviously been adapting and adjusting as I went along. Thank you, Pieter, Helena, and Melanie for those very interesting presentations too. Very inspiring. Always love it when people study what we do as well. So I'm going to share a couple of personal reflections, but I should say as well that they are rather my reactions as a practitioner to some of the themes that I have seen come up in this research and in the presentations. And they're not necessarily direct responses, not least because I don't want to sound like an idiot. And I'll stick to my turf. And I'll also add the little disclaimer that I'm not necessarily the deep expert in each of these areas I'm going to discuss, but I'm rather the guy with the strategic overview who tries to make all of these things make sense together. But one thing that jumped out at me, one reflection that jumped out at me was around using data to understand our audiences. And as practitioners, as communicators, we always kind of start from this point where we presume all data that we're getting is partial. Social media reflects the opinions of people on social media. News media reflects the opinions of those who write in newspapers and who the people who have written in newspapers bother to talk to. Public consultations represent the views of people who have time to carry out public consultations or to take part in public consultations. So as practitioners, we kind of draw on this broad range of data and we monitor how it evolves and how it changes depending on the purpose. So this can involve everything from social media data to media monitoring to focus grouping to political reporting to, as I mentioned, public consultations. And then even within these categories, you can go granular depending on what purposes you have. So social media can be used quantitatively. So monitoring keyword mentions to assess coverage or big coverage coming up, or monitoring engagement to assess how interesting people find things. But it can also be used qualitatively. So we can use our community managers and speak to our community managers to reflect on discourse development and how narratives land and the reactions we have. And sometimes we can even use that to preview what's going to come up in the press. And we're essentially listeners as well as broadcasters. We monitor as well as engage. And what we read feeds back and informs the way that we communicate, but also can feed back further into political and policy decisions. So but all that said, we're never under the illusion that we have complete data. So we can use it to get a sense and monitor a few metrics to see who's moving where, but there's always the presumption that it's partial. And I have a couple of reflections on that. So the first is on why do we monitor the data, which is not always to figure out what to say to people, but rather to know how they're reacting and to understand the reactions. We're not trying to go out and make everybody perfectly happy. Depending on who you are, who you're informing, what kind of debates you're trying to open up, or what leadership direction you're trying to strike. That's more what you're trying to do by through the monitoring. But then at the same time, the analysis can feed into how you tweak messages and tweak communication. So understanding people's desires, interests, understanding how to frame and adapt conversations, or where to go to address specific audiences. And then the other reflection is what's kind of different about social media compared to these other things like media monitoring and focus grouping and everything that I mentioned, is that we have vast oceans of data that were not available before. And that comes as a result of the tools for finding it, but also obviously the vast amount of data generated by the platforms themselves. And this large volume of data, I've been doing this for the guts of a decade now, and I can tell you that we've gotten a lot better. But I remember the early days when this vast ocean of data overwhelmed us. And there is still quite a lot of debate over how to use it in some senses. And that's, I guess, the other reflection is whether this data is used well or not, it's still going to shape decisions. So it's just as interesting to see how it's used the wrong way as the right way, because it's all feeding back. my other kind of broad reflection is in this area of European conversation or European debate. And I guess Melanie's research findings broadly match what I observe in my day-to-day work, which is there is no European public space really, but it arises occasionally, and it usually arises around controversial issues or contentious issues, sometimes around and often around opposition to the EU, and a lot of the kind of pan-EU figures are those who are anti-EU politicians or polemics. But then that's not to say pro-EU actors can't do it, and often they achieve it through strong positive narratives that can be related to people on a larger scale. So when it comes to social media in this context, like there is a lot of potential there. That said, we need to recognize the limits. It's not a silver bullet, again, as Melanie observed. Just as the data we extract only provides a partial picture, social media is only a partial tool, and it needs to be used as part of a whole toolbox. And that said, there are unique opportunities in this specific tool. So the reach of social media gives us the potential to connect with a lot of people around Europe. If we get the formula right, we have offices in every member state to connect with people and adapt to the local context for a reason, and that's never going to become irrelevant. There's also benefits to emerging technologies that are built into the platforms themselves, and I think that some of them that will grow in future. We'll see new opportunities, and that an obvious one being machine translation. And then there's also a lot of possibility for engagement and conversation, both as institutions and as individuals advocating for the EU project. Now, it's also true that there are still gatekeepers. There are new gatekeepers, as Helena observed. But as Helena observed, there have always been gatekeepers too. Journalism makes value judgments on what to cover all the time, and often in a very imperfect way. An obvious example of that always jumps out at me is how journalism fails consistently to cover climate change in an effective way. Same goes for so many different actors that are supposed to be responsible for communicating the European project back: MEPs, governments, all of these different organizations supposed to carry the messages home. And to use all of these platforms involves a huge amount, or to use these regular traditional challenges, it usually takes quite a lot of investment in terms of time or money or other resources, whatever it is. And that's one of the actual big benefits of social media. And again, it's not completely perfect, but what it does really do is it opens up the playing field significantly. Your imperfect gatekeepers are algorithms and the profit motivated decisions to tweak them in different directions. But it does open up other possibilities, like new voices entering the conversation, like lowered costs to participation, new channels and routes to connect with people living in Europe. And it's not perfect, but the possibilities it offers for me as a practitioner are very exciting. So I'll leave my personal reflections there.
Thank you, Tom, for the reflections. I will now jump to the Q&A part. We have several questions here that I will try to divide. I will start perhaps one we received to Melanie. I'm going to read. Concerning your study, do you have any information if the engagement differs when we analyze other social media services like Twitter or Instagram? Are there any studies on this matter?
So in our study, we only focused on Facebook. I don't have any. I therefore don't have any insights into how the platform would have affected our findings. But this is definitely a very important question, and we are now working on a follow-up project which focuses on national election campaigns on social media, and there we will also compare different platforms, because the platforms are different, and how user attention works on the platforms might also differ, and this is something we are definitely interested in. But for the moment, I have unfortunately no answer to this question.
News very, very soon, apparently. Thank you, Magin, for your answer. Tom, we have received a question here. I'm going to read to you. The question is, when it comes to future research in the area, Pieter said we should go beyond the number of likes, retweets, comments, and understand what engagement really means. Do you agree? What's your assessment of what should be the focus of research and policy in the future? Tom, what are your assessment of this?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Well, this is one of the most, going beyond the quantitative is a fascinating thing. What I would love to understand a bit more is the types of conversations that go full European and how they evolve. Because a lot of the time I've seen some kind of, occasionally I see kind of discourse analysis that looks at a particular conversation, but day to day, what I find most interesting is, or well, not day to day, but week to week, is watching how conversations evolve over time. It was very interesting, for example, to see what different priorities were emerging throughout COVID, to just choose a topic, because obviously week by week, depending on what the newest development was, you could see conversations moving in different directions, and this was very interesting because you could see where people's priorities were moving them, and what values and motivations were driving them, and then we would kind of begin to get an instinct for how to assuage them or how to respond more. So I feel like understanding these dynamics of conversations on social media in particular, which is a unique environment with unique kind of signals and little features, is interesting.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to read the question also to Melanie now from Darius Giebe. He says, thank you all for your presentations. Melanie, I was wondering if you had a look at posts which were also sponsored or political ads, and if party funds thus matter for your findings.
Yes, thank you. So actually, we excluded such posts from our analysis. So we coded them, but for this analysis, we only included posts which were not sponsored and which were not ads. We are still in the process of analyzing the data, so we have the data to find that out. But again, unfortunately, I don't have an answer for this question right now. But it's a good idea doing that in the future with our data.
Thank you, Melanie. Tom, back to you. Perhaps there's a question here directed to you, following also Melanie's presentation. So the question reads, Melanie said in her presentation that European Union politicians should make the European Union relevant and salient to reclaim the narrative and focus more on policy topics in which the European Union is more experienced. Do you agree? What can the European Union do more in terms of message and online presence?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess it would, first of all, to differentiate between the different types of politicians who are acting in the European Union forum. It's very hard to say anybody, to pin a responsibility on anybody to go back and communicate on the EU's behalf. That was always the presumption of what would happen in the beginning, but governments will always go back and communicate what's best for the government. MEPs will go back and communicate what will get them elected. This is one of the reasons, in fact, that I think that EU communication has developed so much over the past few decades, is the realization that one cannot rely on politicians to communicate those issues without adding their own frame, which is fair enough. I mean, it's politics, but that I think that it's super interesting that you or like the idea of framing issues around or communicating harder on issues where the EU has agency, right? I used to work in trade. My job before my current job was I was the speechwriter on trade, and one of the very kind of nice things was that the EU has a lot of power in trade. It's an exclusive competence, and so when you can go out and you can say that you're going to do concrete things, and that's always makes things more tangible, and adds a bit of force behind your communication, because your communication can never be better than your policy. But one of the things we see a lot on social media in particular is that, and it's also something related to the nature of social media, is a lot of people calling for the EU to do things in areas where the EU has no power and no competence and no agency. And that's just one of the day-to-day challenges that we have to accept and deal with and figure out ways to get around or speak around. And one of those things, for example, is to report this back and to say people want the EU to act more in this area. And this is where I'm talking about feeding back more. And this is not just about social media now. I'm also thinking about things like the Conference on the Future of Europe, where we hear recommendations that the citizens should act in particular in this kind of participatory process. Citizens recommend the EU should act in X, Y, and Z area where we have no power, but now there's a menu of things that citizens want us to do.
Thank you, Tom, for your reflections in this as well. I would perhaps, attendees can still write their questions if they have ones, but there's one here again for Melanie from, from Astrid Rasch, asking on the question of how one might go about studying engagement more qualitatively, and following up from Melanie's point that citizens have power to shape the visibility of posts. Do we know whether users are aware of this power and whether they are deliberately using it? How would we go about studying that? Melanie, can we hear your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think some users are definitely aware of that and try to use that deliberately, but definitely not all users. So I think there is probably a rather small group of informed, politically interested users who try to use that power deliberately, but we must also be aware of that individual users do not have that much power. So if one individual user likes one post or shares one post, that does not make such a large difference. It becomes a difference if many users behave in the same way. And this can, of course, be used for starting a kind of campaigns on social media. And we have seen that in the past. So we have seen that certain groups try to make certain topics more visible. We see the same on Twitter with hashtags. So for example, the Me Too campaign was one example how users tried to use that power, and I would say they were quite successful in this case. It's certainly not always that successful. But I think a lot of user engagement also happens less consciously and not direct in the direction with making things more visible. When people share things, they often do not really think about that. They just think their friends might be interested in that, and they do not see the larger picture, which is not a problem at all. It's just normal. But if we want to learn more about that from a qualitative angle, then I would say qualitative interviews or also focus groups with users would be a good idea. And here I would see the challenge that we would not just include those users who are already politically very interested and know about these mechanisms, but also including users that are not that interested in politics, because this is probably a very large group, and it would be interesting to hear what thoughts these people have about user engagement and politics on social media.
Thank you, Melanie, for your answer. We have reached the end of our webinar. Two final notes before we go. So this webinar was recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. Both the speakers and the attendees will be notified once the video is on. Also, this discussion was based on a thematic issue published on the topic early this year. I will again share the link with you all. It is accessible anytime, anywhere. As always, it's open access. I would like to thank our speakers today for their presentations. Pieter for helping us putting together this webinar, also Melanie, Helena for their presentations, and Tom, of course, for your reflections after the presentations. And a big thank you as well to our attendees for your questions and interaction with our speakers. We'll see you all in our next webinar. Thank you very much.